Hello, everyone. We have a few more people still coming in, but I think we'll get started as we have a full and exciting program today. Welcome to our third webinar in the Reimagining Childhood Studies series. My name is Rachel Rosen, and together with Spiros Spyru and Sharada Balagopoulos, who are, you can see here in the images, we're organizing this series, and we have one more planned webinar after this one entitled Liberalism's Erasures. We are really pleased by the interest in the series and the appetite for critical engagement. There's already over 100 people here today, with over 200 people joining in the other set webinars. As I was saying, some of you may have heard, only the panelists can use their video and microphones, but we invite you to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and to chat throughout the event. We've organized these webinars in a slightly different format than traditional childhood studies panels by taking up three concepts that to date haven't been widely mobilized in childhood studies, but are part of broader scholarly discussions. And we're using the seminars to consider the concept's productivities for childhood studies. Our hope in doing so is that we can push doxas and boundaries of current thinking in the field, and so even if the concepts prove problematic or less than productive, we hope this does sort of take the field in new directions by opening up these broader debates and developments in social theory. Before going on to introduce our topic for today's webinar, Childhood's Refusals, I'd like to share our plan with you for the webinar and some practical details. For today's events, we have three distinguished scholars who will offer us their insights into the concept of refusal as it relates to childhood and childhood studies. Nadera Shalhubab Karvokan will speak about Unchilding Interrupted, Reflections from Palestine. Fekili Komal will speak about cartographies of Black refusal in early childhood studies. And Valeria Hebet will speak about everyday violence in childcare in the global South, refusal as a useful theoretical and methodological tool. This part of the webinar will be coordinated by Spiros. The remaining time will be devoted to questions and answers. So as the conversations are going on, if you've got questions for the speakers, please can you use the Q&A function, which you can find by hovering over the bottom of your screen, and you'll see the Q&A function and you can post your question there. Please do include your name and affiliation when you post your question. We'll then be selecting questions and putting them to the speakers after the three talks. Unfortunately, we won't get to every question, but we hope that we can have a good dialogue together. This part of the discussion will be coordinated by Sharada. Sort of final note is just to say that the webinar is being recorded, and we plan to make the videos of the webinars available to those who cannot attend in order to create an archive for students and scholars engaged in the project of reimagining the field. And we'll share the links with you during the chat today, and also after we'll be sending the links around. So let me then move into the topic for today, which is childhood's refusals. So over and against the slow violence of settler colonialism, racialized capitalism, and environmental injustice, which we've been speaking about in previous webinars in this series, refusal has made its way into the lexicon of activist research methodologies and critical social theory to both applause and critiques. On the one hand, refusal to make visible the actions of marginalized social groups, which researchers often do out of a concern that they may harm these groups or justify disdain to them. This, in some cases, is viewed as tantamount to a form of romanticized essentialism. And the result, argues Sherry Ottner, is a flattening and dehumanizing of the complexity of the social world. But refusal does not need to be understood only in these terms. Refusal can also be viewed as a decolonial act that presses the limits of a liberal politics of recognition, And notably here is the work of Audra Simpson, who argues that the act of making oneself knowable and rights-bearing through claims to categories of citizenship, fetishized ways of knowing, or propertizability, these only capture and contain marginalized people's demand for justice. In her terms, such struggles for recognition are always already forged within structures of violence, domination, expropriation, and only serve to sediment their authority. In contrast to recognition or resistance, Simpson theorizes refusal as a turning away, both a rejection of state apparatuses nurtured in colonial empire and a repudiation of what we might call a form of racialized capitalist realism after Mark Fisher. Refusal, in these latter terms that Simpson offers us, is both a research sensibility and a political stance. We can witness it in social movements and everyday acts, as subaltern peoples reject and evade socio-legal categories that justify their detention, deportation, displacement, occupation, or expropriation. Refusals can also be found in acts which transgress the material manifestations of racialized capitalism through anything from irregular border crossings to what Savannah Shange writes about as dancing, stomping, singing in refusal of the state's efforts of Black governability through scholarization in the United States. Refusal can be seen in the demands of research participants to determine which aspects of their stories to render public, a limit set by subaltern communities on researchers' gaze and pen, and to avoid compromising their political gains. Refusal manifests in the childhood studies scholarship of Amy Mack and Jan Newberry as the young Indigenous interlocutors they're working with disdain the position of cultural expert or agentic child, which the researchers seek to put on them. Understood in these ways, refusal can be seen as a challenge to researchers, a challenge for us to avoid complicity in our interlocutors' marginalization, be this through voyeuristic representations of pain and trauma, which obscure the structural and intersectional causes of these pains, or through acts which might surface hidden sociability in ways that puts it to use for the benefit of the privileged. For example, the way Silvia Federici writes about the mobilization of kin and community networks, which are put to work in the service of debtors. Proponents of refusal are insistent that it's more than a no. It's not just a turning away. It's also a turning towards. And they highlight its creative, therefore they highlight its creative and generative edge. Refusals invite researchers to question theories of change motivated and represented by victim narratives. They allow people to, in turning away, they provoke novel imaginaries, new modes of analysis, and transformative political projects. And so Tuck and Yang urge us to turn the locus of our gaze away from these sort of pain narratives or politics of recognition, and instead turn the locus of our gaze to historicized interrogations of power, state institutions, political economies, and unjust spaces. These debates about refusal, these efforts to theorize and conceptualize refusal, have been increasing in social theory more broadly, but they haven't had a wide engagement to date in childhood studies, although notable exceptions I've mentioned already. And in part, this is related to the strong focus on recognition and inclusion of children in childhood by scholars in our field. So we hope to question, extend, consider what refusal offers us in contrast to a politics of recognition. And we've invited today's commentators, and we invite the audience to reflect with us on some of the following questions. What does refusal as method and act mean in the context of critical childhood studies, given the thorny problems of power-laden generational relations and oppressive infrastructures of listening? What refusals have we as childhood studies scholars missed, ignored, or erased, and to what effect? How does refusal help us to theorize what Spiros, Dan Cook, and myself ask in the book Reimagining Childhood Studies? We ask the question, which children in childhood do we bring into being through our scholarship, and which do we preclude? So how can refusal help us to think about this question? In powerfully proposing that we shift our unit of analysis away from marginalized peoples and pain narratives, how might we reimagine childhood studies centering of children's voice, expertise, and agency within a politics of recognition? In turning away from these, what are the institutions, the sites, forms, modes of power, and mutating forms of capital realism in the lives of marginalized children, which are the ones that demand exploration, interrogation, and reimagining? And how might these be studied in ways which do not erase children and childhood from the social? These are obviously just some of a few questions which we might consider today, and we're really looking forward to the contributions of our commentators to start us off in thinking through these questions. So I will now pass over to Spiros, who will be introducing the commentators. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce our three distinguished speakers for today's webinar. Each one has given us superb scholarship that opened up our minds to new ways of thinking, and I'm sure they will do the same tonight. Let me just remind everyone to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to post questions to the speakers. If your question is addressed to a specific speaker, please mention their name, and also, if you don't mind, use your name and affiliation together with your question. So now I am truly delighted to introduce our first speaker, Professor Nadira Chaloub-Kevorkian. Professor Chaloub-Kevorkian, a Palestinian feminist, is the Lawrence D. Beale Chair in Law at the Faculty of Law, Institute of Criminology, and the School of Social Work and Public Welfare at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the Global Chair in Law, Queen Mary University of London. Her research focuses on trauma, state crimes and criminology, surveillance, gender violence, law and society, and genocide studies. She studies the crime of femicide and other forms of gender-based violence, violence against children in conflict-ridden areas, crimes of abuse of power in settler colonial context, surveillance, securitization, and social control. Chaloub-Kevorkian is the author of numerous books, among them Militarization and Violence Against Women in Conflict Zones in the Middle East, the Palestinian Case Study, published in 2010, Security Theology, Surveillance and the Politics of Fear, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. And she just published a new book examining Palestinian childhood entitled Incarcerated Childhood and the Politics of Unchilding, which is probably of great interest to this group. As well as a new edited book entitled Understanding Campus Community Partnerships in Conflict Zones, and another two co-edited books, one on the sacralization of politics and its effects on human suffering, and another one on Islamic gender-based violence. She has published articles in multidisciplinary fields in journals such as British Journal of Criminology, Feminist Studies, Ethnic and Racial Studies, State Crime, Violence Against Women, Social Science and Medicine, Science, Law and Society Review, and International Journal of Applied Psychoanalytic Studies. As a resident of the old city of Jerusalem, Chaloub-Kevorkian is a prominent local activist. She engages in direct actions and critical dialogue to end the inscription of power over children's lives, spaces of death, and women's birthing bodies and lives. Her talk today is titled Unchilding Interrupted, Reflections from Palestine. Nadira, welcome to our webinar.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be with this group and to share my work. So let me just share my PowerPoint presentation. Can you see it? Yeah? Okay. So let me start by saying by a voice of a young Palestinian girl, Lama. Lama is 12 years old, a Palestinian child from occupied East Jerusalem that spoke to me while pointing at the military checkpoints recently erected in the communal space of Damascus Gate, saying, and I quote, "Every morning on my way to school, I see those new checkpoints. I call them my classmates call them this way, the killing boxes, and ask myself, who else do they want to kill today? My childhood is loaded with their killing boxes because they do not consider us as children at all." The killing boxes, as Lama defined them, suggest that the state's judicial order, constructed as watchtower in Lama's land space, exploited her childhood years, including her morning walk to school between 7 and 8, as a site of violent militaristic penetration. Walking with Lama, hearing her explanation about historical atrocities against her loved ones, watching her pointing her finger at the killing boxes uncovered not only the state's technology of brutal expulsion, but also how violence marks children's bodies and life as disposable, unchilded others. So unchilding, I argue, exposes the racialized political work of violence designated to create, to direct, to govern, to transform, and construct colonized children as dangerous, racialized others, enabling their eviction from the realm of childhood itself. So unchilding is aligned with the and operate along the twisted logic of necropolitics, whereby the present and historical realities of who has died in the past, who gets to be born, live, and who is left to die now, actually or symbolically, violates the purity of historical context across time and space and becomes inscribed instead on children's bodies, on children who are always already illegitimate, non-subject. So in my book, I define unchilding as an uncompromising practice and ideology whereby violence against children becomes part of the war machine. Unchilding as the deprivation of childhood, I quote, operate profoundly through the disruption of the intimate that is embodied in the biopolitical and visceral, as well as through the global and local politics of silence, negligent intervention, and inaction. So the concept of unchilding exposes the way children are political capital in the hands of the colonizer, and unchilding can be theorized in terms of a politics of refusal. It allows us to reveal the multiple layers of state violence, including its founding violence and its ongoing disciplinary biopolitics and necropolitical power. Analyzing children's refusal when and while incarcerated within violent frames, it invites us to look and to question whose children are counted, yeah, and search for the unending mundane moments of dispossession. So the 7 in the morning when Lama and her classmates face the violence of the killing boxes while on their way to school, which creates the political work through which to govern her life and to prevent her futurity. Examining refusal alongside the unchilding magnifies the discourses or narrations that construct the unchild as part of the colonial war machine. To appropriately understand both the experience and dire consequences of unchilding, I argue we must engage and understand in refusal. Theorizing refusal as the interruption of unchilding engages with the work of feminist indigenous scholars like Tina Camp and Audra Simpson and others, and of course Palestinian scholars like Reimagining and others. By connecting refusal, or raft in Arabic, and sumud, refusal is understood as a desire to challenge the spiraling state's attack and practices of unchilding that renders Palestinian as disposable. So the urgent refusal to accept Palestinian precarity is a refusal to accept a social order that renders childhood and children illegible. Let me move to the voice of Wael and the way his childhood is interrupted. Wael lives from Gaza. He said, "We live in the refugee camp. I can live better if I take a boat, take all my family and leave. Even in the sea, they blocked us, but I'm still preparing my boat. Now, Wael's voice necessitates that we look at his unchilding and unchilded life alongside or against his refusal to accept entrapment and precarity. His refusal to be unchilded is full of radical and transformative possibilities. Wael's refusal represents the refusal, the sumud, the rafd of many Palestinian children in refugee camps, in boats, and on land, as well as those living in Bantustans. Children's refusal is an acknowledgement that they live inside the killing boxes, in containers of all the unmarked histories of unchilding. Their refusal, their rafd, is connected to settler colonialism, which refers to colonialism premised on the removal of the indigenous people from land and the creation of a knowledge system and an infrastructure to serve the settler. So Wael and Lama's refusal are about decolonization that speaks land, livability, and belonging, and asking, and they are imagining a future. The question I grapple with is, how do such understandings of refusal merge the profane and the proper, the past and the present, to suggest some possibilities for the future? Through the lens of refusal, the unchilded in Palestine teach us about the intense emotional search for an open sea, a dismembered camp, a homeland that is not in exile. Refusal can be detected in the words, stories, images, also in embroidery, in music, in dabka dance, and more. The war machine against the unchilded carries effective registers. So refusal for critical childhood scholars means to strive to understand, create meanings, and keep thinking, because children are in the boats, in the camp, in Bantustan, and sometimes in death zones. Building on what Gayatri Spivak has named epistemic violence enacted in and through the formation and production of colonial knowledge, I argue that refusal goes against unchilding by disturbing hegemonic dispossession. Using Tina Camp's definition of refusal as, and I quote, the urgency of rethinking the time, space, and fundamental vocabularies of what constitute politics, activism, and theory, as well as what it means to refuse the terms given us to name these struggles. So I look at the walk to school, the gaze at the occupier, the demolished house, the stone thrown at military vehicles or personnel invading spaces of childhood as refusal. Childhood refusal appears to challenge the unending violence. Their eyes wonder how the racial settler will stay forever. How can we imagine the end? How can we imagine otherwise? In this moment of crisis, do we accept humiliation or imagine otherwise? So children are creative, devote time to think the otherwise when their homes and schools, their fathers, mothers, teachers, and community, the local, but mainly the global, are failing them. Children are thinking otherwise. In analyzing refusal from Palestine, I want to flag a couple of topics. Number one, the naming. So cartographically, we need to name that state's tactic of eligibility and action situate outside the state's proper action. So we see here that naming pays attention to infrastructures that makes political action legible, reiterating domination and rendering otherized bodies, as what De Silva would say, at the limits of justice. Number two, asking who controls the narrative. In the Palestinian case, when the child is always called terrorist, it's a major question. So we need to look at always examine who controls the narrative. And here I theorize refusal as non-engagement with the racialized dispossession that names them as terrorists based on archives of Palestinian children. Third, the war machine that sears the consciousness. Here I examine refusal ontopolitically, insisting that today's politics is about searing the consciousness to control not only people's act, but rather their minds. And fourth, thinking otherwise or refusal goes beyond the liberal politics of recognition. Refusal is the micro labor in the micro spaces. It's a space for thinking and imagining otherwise. And fifth, to unpack hegemonic violence. And I think there is a major concern in looking at state claim that only state violence is legal. So how do we define violence when we're looking at refusal? And 6, examine children as political capital in the hands of the state. So here I would like to take you to different voices of children. And I'll start with Rahaf, because Rahaf is a 4-year-old girl that watched her house being demolished in Jerusalem. Her drawing revealed her mother's pain, her grandparents' fight against demolition, her screams and crying. And when I asked her, "Is this your whole family?" she responded, "You mean my father? I did not ask him to be my father. He was smoking when the bulldozers were demolishing the house." So Rahaf's voice critically engaged in liberatory potentials, yeah? Her voice really is a refusal to reproduce the relations of domination and uprooting. It's a fundamental refusal to care for her father's loss as pain, as her way to challenge the biopolitical and necropolitical regime. So Rahaf disowned her father's fatherhood in order to survive the effect of the demolition. Second, the portraits of Dima. And Dima Alwawi was less than 12-year-old when she was arrested. She's the youngest Palestinian prisoner. And her house is between 2 settlements where settlers used to attack the family for a long time. And at one point, she decided to go out and to defend, to refuse all what happened. Dima's ordeal insisted that children are not detached, are not disconnected. Her act combined a moment of refusal and an opportunity to reach out and defend her family from unending suffering. It combined moments of linkages between politics of land grabbing and the global and local politics of silence, yeah? And the last portrait that I wanted to share with you, so her refusal to be absent and a search for possibility in a condition of impossibility, yeah? And the last portrait is, I want to show you the Kahak Smugglers. And let me give you a background about the smugglers. The children that, here a group of children that were prevented from selling kahak, which is bread, managed to make a hole in the Israeli separation wall to smuggle the Palestinian bread, a step towards livability against the necropolitics, articulating their aspiration for the bread, unsettling the various forms of governmentality that is based on the exclusion and the eviction of the Palestinian is about refusal, a refusal to lose homeland, to lose bread. So refusal in the fight for bread is an insistence for the right to exist under a toxic politics that may well lay waste to the future, as De Vies would say. Let me conclude. Just to show you them.
طول فهد طول على الكاميرا طول على الكاميرا شو تسوي فهد؟ بحرك بالقاعد ليش من هون طيب؟ لأنه مش راضي يمرقنا.
Yeah. So I want to end with Wael from Gaza, who said that even if they constructed walls in the sea, I stay stronger than them, because by being, I scare them, because they committed crimes against us all. I stay stronger, even while imprisoned in the camp. So I think that element of the power of morally higher than others. So unchilding as and refusal requires us to remember that children are political capital in the hands of the colonizing state, and we should really not forget that, and that children refuse to look away, thus to work through and engage with precarity of Palestinian life. So the visuality and physical presence of the aggression and of the occupation is what they are refusing. Refusal do not always mean participation. It can be refusing the term of getting a permission to be. And what we have seen in Lama, in Rahaf, in Wael, that they wanted to be. So refusal of unchilding addresses the ethical dimension of the global present and the future institutionalized of racial subjugation. Refusal of unchilding reveals how the arsenal of epistemic knowledge that defined Palestinian children as born criminal, terrorist, dangerous others rendered the ongoing violence not only expected, but also globally and locally justified. So I think that our role is to really to not only to remember that children are political capital, question the foundation of the field in search for mobilization, deploy abolitionism in studying childhood in colonial conflict and settler colonial context and history, creating radical alternative spaces of thought, methodologies, practices, and actions. It's an act against global carcerality and carceral geographies, and that disrupt the legitimacy of state criminality and racial capitalism in order to open an entry point for possibility of living for children. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Nadira, for a very powerful and stimulating presentation, which has not only invited us to think about the specific circumstances of Palestinian children, but also more generally about the concept of refusal and what it can offer us when thinking about children and childhood, connecting refusal with childhood disposability and state violence. You offer a brilliant account of what this intersection and how this intersection materializes in real children's daily lives. I am sure we'll get interesting questions and discussion about these issues that you raise. So thank you so much. And now I'm very excited to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Fekili Komal, who will offer us her own thinking around the concept of refusal. Dr. Fekili Komal is an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, the University of Toronto. Her work is centered on environmental and place-attuned early childhood education that is situated within and responsive to children's inheritances of settler colonialism, anti-Blackness, and environmental precarity. Her book, Decolonizing Place in Early Childhood Education, published by Routledge in 2019, examines the entanglements of place, environmental education, childhood, race, and settler colonialism in early learning contexts on unceded Coast Salish territories. Her talk today is titled Cartographies of Black Refusal in Early Childhood Studies. Fekili, welcome to our webinar, and we really look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. It's great to be with you all here with you all today. So anti-Blackness is central to understanding ongoing conditions of Black life in North America. And in countering and writing against what has felt like an overwhelming intensification of anti-Blackness, both within and beyond education recently, I've found myself in deep embodied resonance with Ruha Benjamin's sentiment that we are drowning in the facts of inequality and injustice. So brought to my context of early childhood education research, I'm similarly concerned about the limited transformative effects of ever more research focused on revealing racial injustice in the early childhood education experiences of intersectionally marginalized Black children. I worry that while this important work can provide tools to interrogate anti-Blackness, it can also circulate and be taken up in ways that perpetuate rather than disrupt deficit pathologizing frames of young Black children. So in questioning the effectiveness of ever more revelations of injustice against Black children, I join others who have articulated the potential of refusing damage-based narratives and visual images of the suffering of marginalized communities. In research, such a politics of refusal includes interrogating the assumption that circulating narratives of communities as damaged is a worthwhile means of effecting change. So put another way, drawing from Eve, Tuck, and Wen Yang, theories of change that rely on pathologizing communities call for an ethos of refusal that includes asking if this research is what a particular community wants and needs. And another important impetus for my interest in early childhood research that shifts away from documenting harm is that we are in a current moment where the interconnected crises of climate disaster, racial injustice, and a global pandemic have further underlined the urgency of a radical breakaway from business as usual. This business as usual includes the normalization of human and more than human injustices that are sustained by racial capitalism. So here justice is understood in its broadest sense and includes the ways in which Black children and families are the subject of individualist, interventionist discourses that circumvent structural culpability in producing inequity. And so that's to say that the current moment of reckoning is for me a turning point that demands movements at multiple scales towards more livable futures. The current moment demands refusals to return to what Dion Brandt describes as an awful normal that is narrativized as minor injustices or social ills that would get better if some of us waited, if we had the patience to bear it. So for me, early childhood studies is one such site for disrupting the idealization of a normal filled with suffering for Black children. And early childhood studies is an important space for imagining and materializing more livable worlds. So in orienting towards inquiry that can imagine and materialize new worlds, I'm interested in exploring a particular kind of disruptive early childhood research. The kind of inquiry I'm interested in foregrounds speculative, fugitive, and creative ways that young children, educators, and researchers can make new worlds. World making that envisions emancipatory Black futures, despite what Christina Sharp names as the overwhelming climate of anti-Blackness. And so I view responding in speculative, situated, creative, and subversive ways as really important because anti-Blackness, particularly in its entanglements with colonial and neoliberal formations, is always on the move and takes shape in multiple ways, attaching to things, people, and places in at times unanticipated ways. And this includes anti-Black formations that are subtle, disguised as progress or even freedom. So for me, Black futurity is an important place to start in thinking about concepts that can attend to Black children's livingness through radical imaginaries. And I draw from the work, as others have done, of Tina Camp as one example of the expression of Black futurity as an onto-epistemological concept that can be put to work in early childhood studies. Camp describes Black futurity as a grammar of possibility that is not simply an expression of what will happen in the future. Instead, Black futurity includes attention to the conditions that are necessary for that future to be realized. As she states, Black futurity is a performance of a future that hasn't yet happened, but must. And I think that the complex temporalities of Black feminist futurity, as articulated by Tina Camp, offer an important antidote to the focus on linear progression in understanding Black children's learning and growth. This linear temporal framing constructs Black children as always already behind, measured against developmental and academic achievement standards that are put forward as universal. So what kind of method of Black futurity as refusal look like in researching Black childhoods? As is to be expected, given the situatedness and nimbleness of practices of Black futurity, there's no universal approach to thinking with Black futurity as method. Importantly, Black feminists have warned against methods that begin with the already known premise of Black dehumanization. And so I take this as an invitation to engage methodological possibilities that don't begin with the dehumanization of Black children and families. And so perhaps then this is an invitation to enact wayward methodologies focused on liberatory Black childhood futures rather than a reproduction of current societal norms. And enactments of Black futurity are also not necessarily found in large-scale resistant movements. Instead, one can engage methods and methodologies that look out, listen for, and sense the affective capacities of Black futurity practices that emerge in the quotidian and mundane. Such practices can be understated and barely perceptible. So Black futurity can be enacted through quotidian practices of refusal, following Camp again. And returning to my earlier point about the limited potential of revealing yet more Black suffering, an ethos of Black refusal is a necessary escape from the unrelenting pathologizing of Black children and families in education, research, and practice. And the word escape is important here. Black futurity can be enacted as situated fugitive practices. These nimble and creative qualities of Black futurity as refusal mean that it is well suited to subverting anti-Black formations in early childhood studies. Black refusal can be made visible through research and pedagogical acts of witnessing Black childhoods in everyday encounters with places, things, people, and other more than human beings. So in my recent work, I've documented a group of kindergarten children's relations with the creek close to their school in suburban Austin, Texas. Malin Villanueva, a Pame and Coetacan educator and researcher, taught the children water songs that honor the creek, its liveliness, and its relatedness to humans. Long after Malin had stopped working with the children, the songs continued to be sung as part of planned curriculum making and in spontaneous moments at the creek. In thinking with these moments, I focused on a young Black girl I call Simone and an image of her facing the creek, playing a drum as her and her classmates sing to the creek. This small moment in early childhood outdoor education context can be read as an example in terms of expected developmental and learning outcomes related to language, social, emotional, and physical and cognitive development. It can also be read in ways that disrupt the focus on the individual developing child. And so I read Simone's Creek encounters through a lens of Black refusal that shows that there are multiple possibilities for subverting deficit constructions of Black children and childhoods and their relations to places. So for example, in revisiting this image, I foreground stories of Simone's ways of being with the creek and surrounding more than human relations as refusals of deficit constructions of Black children's relations with the more than human world. These modes of refusal take seriously the inherent spatialization of Blackness. So this mode of refusal affirmatively inquires into Black children's place relations while intentionally subverting discourses of non-belonging. This work also refuses discourses that position nature as a way of fixing Black children's so-called achievement gaps in behavior. So a focus on Black refusal helps me to bring analytic attention to Black unbounded life and unruly Black subjectivity. So for me, this is a research practice that asks in what ways representation can work in liberatory enactments of Black life. So I witnessed also another image of Simone's spontaneous act of leaping into the creek waters as unruly Black subjectivity. I see this in the joyful affects that come together in relation with splashing creek waters, rubber boots, water bottle in hand, Simone's body emotion, the presence of her classmates, and more. Read as quotidian registers of refusal and futurity, this small moment matters for me as a refusal of the anti-Black conformity that is structured into linear, progressive, and developmental modes of understanding Black childhoods. So Simone's relations with the creek through joyful, playful encounters matter for affirming her Black childhood and Black childhoods more broadly. So following Ting at camp, listening to images as Black refusal means that I notice not only what is visible by looking at the image of Simone, but also the ways in which the images affect and move me. So I suggest then that listening for Black refusal requires making effective connections to the material discursive things, beings, knowledges, and happenings that come together in the making of images of Black children. In this particular example, this includes noticing Simone in relation to materialities of objects, place, lands, and waters. Simone in disruptive embodied relation to discourses of Black childhood unbelonging in places and discourses of Black childhood non-innocence. Simone in relation with her classmates as together as they sing to the creek, and Simone in pedagogical relation to the indigenous presences and knowledges brought by Malin. So listening to images as Black refusal activates sensorial, temporal, spatial, and material discursive cartographies of Black childhood futurities. As seen in this example of Simone's everyday relationalities, cartographies of Black refusal are not interested in universality or researcher objectivity. They are effective, subjective, and creative practices of immersion in the visualities of research and pedagogical events with the intention of listening for, looking out for, and feeling Black refusal as futurity. They are embodied practices of Black storytelling. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fekili, for your thoughtful and very insightful presentation and for your critical take on the concept of refusal. Thinking about early childhood studies, for example, as a space for disrupting the injustices of anti-Blackness and its entanglement with colonialism. You offer us much to ponder on and work with when considering the potential value and utility of refusal as both a theoretical and methodological tool for childhood studies in general. Once again, thank you so much. I would like to remind everyone again to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to pose questions to our speakers. And if your questions addressed to a specific speaker, please mention their name as well as your name and affiliation. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our last speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Valeria Hebet. Valeria Hebet holds a PhD from the University of Buenos Aires with emphasis in social psychology. Her interests center on the politics of inequalities in children's and women's rights, while her work focuses more generally on welfare policies and rights protection, as well as experiences of the urban poor. Recently, Valeria conducted a research study on memory of childhood experience under the last dictatorship in Argentina. She's a researcher in the National Council of Research and full professor in the School of Humanities, where she teaches the undergraduate seminars on human rights in education, introduction to gender studies and childhood and youth studies, as well as seminars on children's rights, policies and politics in the master program of human rights at the University of La Plata. She currently serves as director of the Center for the Studies of Inequalities, Subjects, and Institutions. Dr. Hebet taught PhD and master's courses in several universities in many different countries in Latin America, such as Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Uruguay, Ecuador, as well as in the US, where she was Tinker Professor at Columbia University and Fellow at the Observatory of Latin America at the New School. Valeria's presentation today is titled Everyday Violence and Child Care in the Global South, Refusal as Useful Theoretical and Methodological Tool. Valeria, thank you for accepting our invitation to participate in this webinar, and we really look forward to your presentation.
Okay. I'd like to start by thanking the organizer for inviting me to share some of my work in this fantastic seminar. My fieldwork has been around the nexus of children's rights and state policies in Argentina and Latin America, focusing on social inclusion programs oriented to marginalized children. I consider this to be a powerful point of entry for understanding the complex contemporary dynamics of government. So when the organizers invited me to reflect upon refusal, I recall my many encounters with the state agents in the community centers that implement the social programs I studied, and what they saw as a stubborn lack of participation, which was always their main concern. These programs are usually workshops in marginalized neighborhoods and include tea and lunches for at-risk children, together with small cash transfers. State agents always speak of those policies as a means for emancipation and expansion of rights. Therefore, citizenship and children's rights, far from being foremost and exclusively state categories for reproducing inequalities or identities that capture and contain demands in a civilized manner to render them legible to the capitalist state, are being understood by those actors as categories that crucially modify children's possibilities of being cared for and for securing their futures. Agents negotiate, or feel they do, transforming their policies implementation in a space of permanent compromise between their goals, objectives, perspectives, and those of the children. And to that end, participation and voice are their main tools, because they legitimize the mere existence of the organizations, gives it a lure of authenticity, and opens up the space for dialogue in which all negotiations can take place. So the lack of participation from the children, their silence, is one of the main constant problems faced by agents and also by researchers. The silent presence of children in the program's offices has the very interesting result of forcing agents and researchers to permanently rethink their positions. In other words, it forces us as adults, as workers, as middle class, to question ourselves. Silence is therefore expressive. It is a point of absolute resistance to signification, as well as a site of proliferation of emotions, interpretations, and consequences. There are many forms of silence. There are some silence that are linked to the silence narratives, that relate to resistance. And there are others that look more like limits or refusals. Silence and refusal seems to be useful to put into question thick approaches to governmentality that see voice and participation as dispositives that are evenly and inexorably forms of rejection. Conversely, it puts into question the claims of emancipation and the possibilities of voicing demands in the space of state-run programs. But also, I think this could lead to a more nuanced understanding of the place of state regulation and rights languages in everyday lives of marginalized children. To elaborate on that, I will choose one example of the multiple and typical ones that emerge over the years of fieldwork. During 2017, the staff at the youth center in which the university team that I belong to collaborates asked us to develop a girls' workshop to provide girls with a space at the center not to be plagued by the boys, always teasing and pranking, and therefore a space to both promote girls' participation in the program as well as a space to talk about gender issues. The center is located in Avisa, a marginalized neighborhood populated by informal or self-employed workers, migrants from rural areas of the country. Two of the girls, 14 years old, always stay at the corner of the large table in the room where the girls' space took place every Monday. Even if we insisted of them joining the workshop after lunch and joke around and try to connect with them, the results were always the same. Both kept silently isolated from the group, judging us. They did not speak with anyone and actively avoid being photographed or including group pictures. Some of the older girls were bothered by their presence, marking their moral connotations of their isolation as a mere performance because they had seen the girls outside the villa acting differently. The coordinator of the center, a young man from the neighborhood, condescendingly nicknamed them the Tupperware girls, a category that comprised other girls too. Their mothers kept them locked up at home, controlled when and how they move around, and did not let them stroll along in the neighborhood. My argument here is that the behavior of these girls could be seen as a form of refusal. A refusal is related to the sociality and the fabric of collective identity and belonging in the villa, and that is productive to reflect upon the theoretical purchase of refusal. In effect, the girls' isolation and their mother's control of their activities and relationships, the active confinement in the private space of their crowded homes, aim to protect them from the lower moral status of the neighbors. The silence and distancing practiced by the girls is somehow an effort to be treated respectfully. It's therefore part of the shared experience in the villa, but it does so through differentiation. From them, the villa does have villeros, but they are not part of them and their work not to be mistaken as one of them. Being part of the youth center was considered by some problematic, precisely because it was part of a space populated by villeros, even though the program was run by a very well-respected member of the community and provided one of the few safe spaces for children in the after-school hours. I'm sorry. Literature on everyday violence in Latin America links these social reproduction dynamics developed by families to the high crime rates that pollute villas and the police end of the state that collides with criminal organizations and is the agent of institutional violence and gatillo fácil murders in those communities. From my point of view, they do so by treating the state as an abstract homogeneous entity that runs an identical mode of regulation at every level and locale, thus equating the state with the police, invisibilizing agencies at the youth centers. But also they do so erasing children's agency and treating the gender issue only as a dimension to classify violence. In that literature, the confinement and the almost complete limitation of autonomy that marks the lives of the girls are identified as care practice that emerge from fear and the naturalization of everyday violence, a microsocial and private link of a chain of violence. Of course, Moral separation, the construction of a life path that is not contaminated by the visa, that allows one to advance to dignified jobs and eventually a life outside, works also as a strategy for separating from the criminality and all its risk. However, reducing all of the meanings of these practices to their connection to violence implies invisibilizing their subtleties and pluralities. Latin American children are viewed almost exclusively through the lens provided by the historical violence of inequality and exclusion, and the contemporary violence that results from the fragility of the state, the illegal or gray economies, and the narco and related crime. This connects with the negative usage of refusal coined by Audra that I find still very much useful to point to deficits in this ethnographic work. In other words, Latin American children are viewed mainly from the point of view of damage and difference, and refusal allow us to reject that perspective and as reductive and reproductive of inequality. The deployment of quotidian practices by children, not only and not even centrally, are related to a territory marked only by violence. Everyday life takes place in a territory incorporated to the state through agencies that base their operation in a language of citizenship and rights. It is with these agencies that children have to interact every day, and these agencies defend them from police violence and provide them with resources and social networks that goes beyond the neighborhood. I do not mean here to adhere to the agent self-representation. It's just that there is a need for a theoretical and political understanding of the contradictions of the state in the everyday life in the vision. There is therefore something problematic emerging from the kind of refusal expressed by the girls, which could be interpreted as a refusal of inclusion through the logic of citizenship, as Simpson understood it. For her, concepts such resistance or recognition remain insufficient in that they often overestimate the place of the state. Furthermore, refusal rejects these hierarchical relationships. But as we can see, or as I try to show, these girls and their families' refusal are intertwined with the space and time created by the state and relies on social hierarchy. To refuse and reject are productive. They build new affiliations in the visa as part of conservative strategies of differentiation, in which belonging to church, for instance, provides a narrative of future won through the moral value of the individual, safeguarded from precariousness and uncertainty, but God's moral. Simpson has proposed that refusal provide us with social relations that structure possibilities, histories, and identities. Individuals and collective refuse affiliations, identities, and relationships in ways that are not about domination or class struggle, but instead about staking claims to the sociality that underlies all relationships, including political ones. But what about a refusal that relies on forms of domination and hierarchies? Appropriation and reivindication of social hierarchy by inhabitants of marginalized communities are organized through narratives of good life that provides with future and hope. But to do so, they must reject the categories of citizenship and rights provided by the state. Morally conservative, neoliberal, and right-wing actors all articulate a meritocratic narrative of inequality that recreates images of welfare cheats, teen mothers, lazy able-bodied unemployed youngsters, child criminals that benefit from state resources. They're joined by new actors that reject children's rights and gender equality as morally condemnable and portray the sexually active girl as an epitome of decay. Refusal is therefore deployed in opposition to the state's ideas of good life through mechanism of distinction, the rejection of secularism and rights language, the reliance on conservative narratives that resist the reinstate patriarchal parental authority and family organization, promote social relations only with equals, reinforce moral restrictions to teenage sexuality, and endorse traditional child-rearing practices. To conclude, I think that this may show a promising use for tools like refusal that link methodological and theoretical discomforts. Categories of exclusion and subordinate inclusion like citizenship and gender children's rights Liberal recognition, even in capitalist third world state, could be one battleground for the future under the global dynamics of contemporary capitalism. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Valeria. That was a really interesting and thoughtful presentation, and you've left us a lot to think about. I particularly like the ways in which you started with and focused on a case study with what you call the Tupperware girls and the girls in the workshop who silenced and practiced kind of distancing as a way to earn respect. And through that, talking about the contradictions of the state and the everyday life of young girls, and particularly allowing us to think with silence as an aspect of refusal, but silence is something that's expressive and is a critique of governmentality and the good life. So you've given us a lot to kind of think with, and pushed refusals in kind of new directions and different directions from our previous two speakers. So thank you for that. We are now going to move to the Q&A session. And just a reminder, if you still have questions, please type them into the Q&A box. We are going to start with questions that have been posed to, sorry, I'm just going to open this up. So Regina Langhout from UC Santa Cruz has a question for Nadira, but we are going to use that question to be opened up for all of the speakers. And so if you could, all of the speakers could please think about, in your conceptualization, how do you see refusal as different and similar to resistance? So we have about like 27 minutes, and we have currently around 5 to 6 questions. So if each one could possibly take around 2 minutes to offer a response, and then we can move on to the next question. So if you want to start with Nadira and move on to Fekili and then Valeria.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that refusal and resistance are intertwined, are interlocked, and especially in settler colonial context, they're divergent. So you see that it engages different aspects of challenging the apparatus of power. So resistance is more of the opposition to direct domination, and refusal, I see it as a disavowal, as rejection, but there is a dialectic, there is an interlocking and intertwined connection and dialect between refusal and resistance. So for Palestinians, for example, that are participating in hunger strike, it's a clear resistance to that domination and that machinery of dispossession. But you see a refusal, and the main refusal in our context is a refusal to be eliminated. So it's a clear position of refusing to be erased, and especially because we're talking about settler colonialism, where it's a structure, not an event, where it's about the elimination, the indigenization of the settler and the elimination of the native, and it's built on the logic of elimination. So I really see that refusal becomes resistance, and resistance becomes refusal in different ways. I see it when talking to kids and the right to insisting on the right to love as part of the refusal of that machinery of oppression and dispossession, but sometimes it's an act of resistance in order to prevent that dispossession. So I guess it's intertwined, I guess it's interlocked, and it goes from refusal to resistance and back to refusal. But we need to keep in mind the context, and the context is this settler colonial context, where even calling a child, as in my different interviews, that you're a refugee, and all of a sudden you hear him telling me, I'm not a refugee, I have a land, I live in my land. It's the international community that is accepting. So it's a refusal of domination, but it's also a resistance to that naming and that framing and that mode of being in the homeland where they want to evict them. So I guess it's complicated.
Thank you. Fekili?
Thanks. Yes, and I think I would echo much of what Nadira has said in terms of the interconnections between them. And so the ways in which I was thinking of refusal could be articulated as, for instance, a resistance to particular discourses and constructions of Black childhoods. But what I also like about mobilizing the term refusal instead in thinking with the way in which Tina Camp engages with it is that I think it creates a possibility of not just working against something, but also thinking about what can be created instead. And so in my work with Black children, I'm thinking about what are some otherwise stories that can be told about Black children? What are the kinds of different worlds that Black children are creating in these everyday spaces that are articulating more livable worlds? So yeah, so I like the creative, subversive, and imaginative and creative ways in which refusal can be mobilized, if that makes sense.
Fekili, Valeria?
Thank you. I was pondering that question before the moment that I received the invitation. And I do not have a straight answer. I still will think that there is refusal in the way that Simpson or Newbery are using it is very powerful. And I think that there is an extremely methodological defiance that it's vividly in the moments in which we are developing fieldwork, for instance. And it's creative in a way that it's different from resistance in the way that it engages with power. But I'm still not very certain of how to proceed with that. I need to keep, reading and understanding the difference. But I think that my colleagues had a much more sound perspective on it.
Thank you, Valeria, and thank you, Nadira and Fekili as well. So most of the questions that we have is kind of pushing the idea of refusal. And the question by Zusa Milef is asking us to think a little bit more across the papers. And so she points out that Fekili's take on refusal and Nadira's take on refusal, although in different contexts, have a lot of commonalities, and asks whether refusal is something to refuse something. Is it to refuse something that's imposed upon you or a way of being offered? So is there a directionality behind refusal, or is it something else? Can there be refusal in inaction? And how is it exactly related to unchilding? So this is specifically for Nadira. So if all of the panelists just want to kind of push the idea of refusal in terms of thinking about each other's papers, as well as whether it has directionality or whether there can be refusal in inaction as well. So thank you. So if we want to just follow the same order, so Nadira, Fekili, and Valerie.
Yeah. Well, I'll go back to taking into consideration the context. So I'm talking about the Palestinian context, and I'm talking about the fact that in other places, when we were looking in childhood studies and critical childhood studies perception, it was about the stolen generation. In Australia, it was about the situation of killing the Indian and saving the child, And my question in unchilding is really asking what exactly the colonial machinery here is doing to the Palestinian child. So unchilding is offered as a refusal, of course, as to disturb hegemonic dispossession that are framing Palestinian children as non-children, yeah? And I hear really my analysis of to connect it to refusal, because unchilding is as refusal, as I said, is using really and engaging with the work of Tina Camp, where she urges us to rethink time, history, space, and the fundamental vocabularies that we are using in politics. And here I can bring, of course, the analysis on the Islamophobic analysis when you're looking at the Palestinian child from that perspective, where there is this security in my previous book on security theology, where I really talk about the two theologies, the biblical theology and the security theology. So the concept, the vocabularies of refusal here are really looking at that politics and the activism and the theory and the machinery that requires us to refuse the terms given to us to name what is going, and the names given to us to name our struggle, because our struggle is on the epistemic element, our struggle is on the actual element, because colonialism is done, for example, legally, and we see how laws are really evicting Palestinians from their land. So my analysis really look at that refusal as a mode of refusing the limited access to humanity by by the colonial machinery of oppression, and it's challenging what is knowable or what is being known and the production of knowledge by those. So there is this refusal to accept the epistemic knowledge, or so it's kind of epistemic disobedient to that machinery of oppression that and Western white analysis of what goes on, especially in relation to our children, especially when I look at the 7 to 8 in the morning and the walk to school among those killing boxes and among those rifles, and the mere gaze of the little girl at those is refusal. It's a refusal of domination. It's a refusal of her unchilding, because she's looked at more as a potential terrorist, a dangerous other. So I go to Fanon's analysis, looking at Palestinian kids in zoological terms.
Thanks, Nadira. Fekili?
I guess I would just say that I was thinking of refusal primarily in relation to thinking about research and how research might tell different kinds of stories about Black children and Black childhoods. And really a response to, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, feeling overwhelmed by the plethora of research that was kind of repeating the story of Black children as damaged. And so that was kind of my main intervention. But I do see a resonance, with the other presentation in terms of thinking about the actual refusals that are enacted by children in their everyday lives and spaces against the ways in which they're constructed. But I was primarily thinking of it in relation to a research method for doing otherwise in relation to Black children and Black childhoods.
Okay, great. Thanks, Fekili. Valeria?
Thank you. And I will just agree with Fekili. My point of entry was mainly from the perspective of rejecting the majority of the literature on Latin American childhoods and in the violence as the narrative on Latin America. But I also had this encounters with this silent presence that it was part of, of rethinking the methodological approach to the fieldwork necessarily, because it's really confronting at the personal level to have someone that is silent, but present, but silent, and to think about that. It was interesting and eventually get to the connection of this question of, as one of my colleagues in the university coined it, the competing models of governmentality that are struggling for the poor. The conservative that is bringing up this ideas of gender ideology against and the need of criminalization of children as the competing with the state narrative of children's rights. So I came to use it from those point of views.
if I may add one point, is that, you know, usually the different theories that are individualizing, traumatizing, or like looking at children from that pathologizing the analysis is where I also came from, because I think that we really need to look at the context. It's not to delete all the psychological theories, but it did not work in this context. And therefore the need to look at critical analysis of childhood. And this is where my concept of unchilding came to speak back to different pathologizing, individualizing. We need to read the child in context, and we need to read children's refusal as part of this condition of dispossession.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think in a lot of the papers, the idea of refusal as part of quotidian and mundane practices came out. And so this next question, which was posed by Lucia, kind of pushes the idea of the concept of refusal against vis-a-vis resistance, whether refusal can account for the more hesitant, ambivalent, compromising contours of social practices of saying no, and can better acknowledge the nuances of systems of oppression where the neatness of refusal acts come to being in a more blurred and mitigated way, and where both the oppressor and the oppressed seem entrapped. So if you could just speak to that dynamic in the idea of refusal. Should we follow the same order? Nadira, Fekili, and then Valeria. I know that this is, I mean, all of you in your responses have kind of answered a lot of this already. And so if you have anything to add, you could add, or we could move on to the next question.
Well, it's hard for me to look at the entrapment of the colonizer. I don't see the colonizer as entrapped. I see the colonizer that is unchilding children as controlling and governing livability and the power to survive it, not as somebody or an entity that is entrapped, but the opposite. It's an entity that is working in different way, that is invading the intimate. And it's all well calculated with the cameras. I'm talking to you from the old city of Jerusalem. You don't need to look wherever you go. There are drones and cameras and surveillance and so on. So I do not acknowledge the entrapment of the colonizer. I think they are well aware of what goes on, but I see that the children are constantly challenging that entrapment. They can detect it, and that I see it as refusal. They can name it, as I said, as Lama called it, the killing boxes, rather than what the hegemony call it, the tower, the watchtower. Watchtower is a very neutral concept. And here she comes and tells me, no, Nadira, it is a killing box, and this is what I see. So I don't see the entrapment. I see a clear governance of life, of death, and of unchilding.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that I have a response to that, but I would say that an important part of my work is to think together about both anti-Blackness and settler colonialism and how they work together. In sometimes, just as anti-Blackness can be in very subtle ways, settler colonialism as well. And so, for instance, in those everyday encounters with Simone, it was really important for us to engage with Indigenous knowledges, to engage with the Creek as an Indigenous place. And so I think about refusal as well as refusing the erasure of Indigenous lands, Indigenous knowledges, as very much part of resisting anti-Blackness as well.
So the only thing I will like to add is that I would put resistance in a more direct, even if it's not a political organization or a political purpose that is followed, there is a political purpose to transform something. And I will always adhere that transformation into some form of progressive imagination, if you will. I mean, that is where it came from, the idea. We can debate on that, and there's a this is the romanticization part of which is being criticized on resistance. That said, yes, the refusal it doesn't lack purpose. It's very determined in some part of it, at least. But I won't choose to understand the positions in which I am in my fieldwork as oppressors and oppressed. I would not choose that that idea to try to understand better how it's working in my fieldwork.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So maybe a final couple of questions. There's a question from Jenny, who asks, how can the concept of refusal disrupt hegemonic paradigmatic perspectives operating within research in the field of early childhood? But we can open it up to childhood studies more broadly. And how can a paradigmatic perspective of refusal reveal new possibilities for researchers and bring new responsibilities? So this affects the teaching of research methodologies within early childhood and childhood studies as well. So again, we could stay with the same order if anybody feels like jumping in. So maybe Nadira, Fekili, Valeria.
Yeah, well, I think that by, both theoretically and methodologically, it's very important to engage with refusal, because in doing so, for example, again, going back to my concept of unchilding, we're looking at different modes of understanding childhood studies. And here, for example, I look at how therapists, social workers, and so on are following with the traditional classical mode of looking at children, intervening with them. And I see them from a critical childhood perspective as those that are becoming pacifiers of hegemony. And therefore, research agenda should look at the welfare system. Exactly, if I connect it to Canada, for example, in that amazing book by Shireen Raza, Dying from Improvement. So everything that was done is to improve the situation, but they're dying from improvement, yes. In our situation in Jerusalem, high rate of home arrest, but that home arrest is turning home into a prison and turning parents into prison guards. And this is a major invasion. And if I rely on scholars such as Bell Hooks and Black scholars, I learn how important is it to be critical and to develop an agenda, methodological and theoretical, that differs from the one that I was taught and I grew up with, and so on. So this is our role as critical scholars.
Thank you, Nadira. Fekili?
I think I would just repeat what I said earlier in terms of seeing a need for more speculative, creative kinds of methods in researching children and childhoods, and maybe also in bringing theories and perspectives that might be not necessarily the ones that are commonly used to think about research in early childhood. And so I found it really generative to think with Indigenous and Black feminisms, to think about my research in early childhood. And so, yeah, I think that's all I would add.
Thank you. Valeria?
I have to agree with both Nadira and Fekili. I think that they put a very important point to this. Adding to that, I will only include the idea that voice perhaps has had an extreme place in research that could have to be romanticized and refusal kind of, I think that moves beyond that, put the idea of voice into perspective.
Great, thank you all. So we have a couple of minutes left, and so I just wanted to ask you all before we leave. So obviously you all were very well known in your fields of research and doing really important work. And I guess it would be really nice if you could share with all the participants how Refusal has pushed your work in particular directions, thinking with and through Refusal.
Well, maybe since I'm starting, let me say that one of the research studies that I conducted is working with Palestinian family to release the dead bodies of their children from Israeli refrigerators. So the question was from different scholars that are studying, what are you doing? How can you work on analyzing? And I'm talking about, I call it necropenology, which is the punishment of the dead body while already in the freezers. And that analysis of looking at children as frozen in the freezer after being extrajudicially killed was something that really pushed me not only to understand the children around that child that was lost, but also the future children. So learning from being in the neighborhood, talking to the kids, and the concept, actually one of the kids' name is Sumud. Sumud is steadfastness. And her refusal to accept the legal discussion, because we needed to go to court, requesting the colonizer to approve the return of the dead body. And her question to me was, how can they try a dead body? How can they take a dead body to the trial? Now, the power of that dead body that speaks justice and fairness and return to the land is where I was working. And that was a space of looking at different methodologies, different theories, but different modes of pushing me as a Palestinian and as a feminist scholar towards looking for new modes of refusing the legal language, refusing the lack of acceptance of the Palestinian narrative, and trying to find ways for livability for children that are living that oppression and that violence.
Thank you. Fekili?
I would just say, as I've said, that it's been really generative for me to think about children's place relations and children's environmental relations in ways that refuse already known kind of stories about Black children and Black children's place relations. And so that's how Refusal has been really important.
Thank you. Valeria?
My encounter with Refusal is extremely recent, so as a concept, but to me it is promising in a way that it helps me to think again and to reconsider the contradiction of the promise of citizenship and rights, because one thing is how to allow the children to refuse to be categorized and include through those categories, but still not lose them into other projects that are extremely conservative or even against the drug cartels or the drug dealers. So how it is kind of a struggle, and so I think it's really interesting to go through that path.
Thank you all. So I just want to thank our three speakers, Nadira, Fekili, and Valeria, for really excellent and really thought-provoking presentations that have really pushed our thinking on refusal and thinking on refusal with children in childhoods in really new and productive directions. So thank you all for your time and for the work that you put into your presentations. Thanks to all of our participants for being here and for your thoughtful questions. Just before we leave, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have our next webinar on the 31st of March, which is focused on liberalism's erasures. And you can sign up for that. If you're already signed up for the webinars, then you will get notification closer to the date. So thanks once again to all of our panelists for making the time to be here, and thank you all for participating. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.